archiving mastery, right? So that's what the topic of this month's webinar, right? I thought this is funny. It reminds me of my childhood watching Ghostbusters. And I get it, it's a library, not archives, but to me, reminds me of the same thing. But what I think is funny is we all have potentially ghosts in our archives. So sometimes we might need to call the Ghostbusters to come in and get that sorted out. Right, as always with our webinars, it is recorded. So if anyone has registered and hasn't attended, then we'll send through the recording. And you can take the recording and share it with your team or whoever you think would be interested in this topic. We'll also post it on LinkedIn as well, and it will go onto YouTube. So if you're following us in those spaces, then you'll be able to pick it up from there. We've also got Q&A. Now, I've got Joe helping to moderate, so if anyone asks any questions, then you'll be able to see that, and I'll try and keep an eye on them as we go as well, and make sure that I'm not skipping too far ahead before we come back and answer some questions. So, right, may as well get started. So, archiving mastery. Before we talk about archiving, I just wanted to talk about information lifecycle, right? So this is a typical kind of workflow for all documents. I mean, it actually goes beyond documents, but today we're just going to specifically talk about your documents and your file shares. So obviously people create content inside of your SharePoint and Teams. They're creating documents, they're creating folders and all sorts in there. And then it becomes a collaborative space. Obviously, SharePoint and Teams, great for collaboration. So they're active files being worked on with the team or with the entire organization, and you can bring external people in, right? So huge value at that stage. Once it becomes like inactive, it just tends to sit there within a library and it's just being stored. And to be honest, that's where most people stop at that point, right? The next two steps is probably the most important part, and we're going to cover those coming up forward, right? So archiving is actually where you take them out of active storage and put them into like cold storage. So if you think about SharePoint as being hot, that's always available, always accessible documents that are being worked on constantly, and then they go into cold storage. They're still accessible. If people need to retrieve them, you could take them back out of the freezer and put them into active storage, but they just sit there in those archives and they are accessible as and when you need them, but they're not active documents. And then you have a dispose routine. So once they've aged out of archiving, then you have to dispose of them, okay? Right. So why does archiving and disposal actually matter? So the number one reason, now this isn't actually, I think, the number one reason why you should consider it, but this is the number one reason why people make the decisions to look at archiving. And it's usually because it saves storage costs. Now, within your SharePoint, you get 1 terabyte plus 10 gigs for every user within your tenant. So if you go beyond that storage allowance that you have within your organization, you then have to start paying for additional SharePoint storage, which is about 38 cents per gig per month, which is, $38 per 100 gigs, and then $380 per terabyte, give or take. There's some rounding there. But yeah, it becomes really expensive if you have more storage in SharePoint. So most people come to us and they're like, hey, we've got to do a cleanup. We've got to get rid of some stuff because we've got to save costs, right? So that tends to be the number one reason, but technically that's not the number one reason, right? The number one reason is more practical than that. So it's all about that information lifecycle and data governance. So who has access to what content at what point in time, and is that information still valid and accurate, right? So that's actually why we have that lifecycle of all of those documents. It actually helps boost productivity and efficiency, right? So I don't know how many times you've tried to find a document and you're drilling into folders to try and find it, and you think, well, it's not there, so you go back out and try somewhere else, and then you realize that there's actually in a completely different place, right? We get too kind of complacent relying on our recent documents and we just click through that. But what I guess my goal in life is to always reduce the amount of clicks it takes in order to find the thing that I have to do, right? So it's all about efficiency and productivity. Even when I can find roughly the location of where those documents are, I want to know this is the actual current version of the document. There's not like 10 versions and I got to work out which one is the one that I need to work on and edit. So this all comes down to that life cycle, right? It's not just 7-year plans. This is like day-to-day document management. version control and things like that, which we will talk about shortly. The other thing is, right, so that boosts productivity and efficiency is all about the human factor, but we are now turning on AI agents within our workspaces. So it becomes even more important for us to start structuring our data so that the AI can read and respond to the correct data and information that you would expect. So when we talk about these documents, if you think about, you might have a set of documents that never gets modified, and that can become a really old document, but it is still true and correct. So if you think of a policy that hasn't changed for 3 or 4 years, right? That is still the single source of truth. Like that's the document, that's what it is. But if you think about other documents, so you might have client-related documents or project-related documents. Now they only have a life cycle of the duration of the project or the client being an active client within your organization. And then you could go even more granular. Like imagine if you had daily changes within a document. So you might have price feeds, for example. So you might have supplier price feeds coming in. Now, yesterday's pricing is now incorrect data. But if you were to ask Copilot, what's the price of a product? You have to make sure that it's only looking at today's price feed, not yesterday's price feed. So there are definitely some documents within your folder structure that are daily changes, and that today's data is the correct and true data, which is why that life cycle really varies on it's like folder by folder, what's correct and what's not correct at that point in time. And then the other reason is to support compliance and legal requirements. So sometimes things like GDPR or ISO, you actually have a requirement to dispose of those documents. And so that's why it becomes important to kind of consolidate your data structure, understand that when you have documents sprawl across all of your sites, if a client left and you have to remove all of their personal information, how do you go and crawl across everything to try and make sure that you've captured everything? And so having information routines of consolidating your data becomes really important as well, okay? So this is the holy grail of SharePoint, and this is what I talk to everyone about. So if anyone's worked with us on a SharePoint project, then you'll know that we talk about the single source of truth. And this comes down to like the best practice or the golden rules. So just remember what they are. So it is not keeping copies of files. So don't keep your own copy. It's like a really like unusual behavior, but everybody does it. Someone sends you a copy, or you know there's a copy of a document inside of SharePoint. It's just easier if I just do a save as and I'll keep it in my own files. But then you're referencing your version of the document, and the true version of the document can change, and now I'm looking at the wrong one. Okay, so try and break that habit. And just make it easy for you to find the correct copy of the document through SharePoint. So create yourself links, not copies. The other one is managing versions. So I quite often see people that will do a save as on a file to create a new version of the file. Now, this one's a bit tricky. Sometimes there's genuinely a reason why you want to create two separate versions of the same file. So you might have client A's version of the file and client B's version of the file. So that's okay, that's legitimate. However, if you're just doing a save as because you want to track changes, you want to see what the last version was, you just turn on versioning within SharePoint, which actually is on by default. But you just have versioning within SharePoint and you can roll back to previous versions. There's a really cool feature within Word that you could do version control side by side and do a comparison between the versions, and you can see what's changed. So that's a little bit like the track changes. So that's another golden rule, like just don't keep copies purely for version control. And then the other one is really just making site owners and team owners more responsible for the information within their environments, right? So they created a team, they have files within the team. As a team's owner, you should be responsible for making sure that those documents are updated and always correct. And then, of course, user training. So we run that champions training to make sure that teams champions know what they're doing. But yeah, just keep reminding your team about document cleanliness and keeping them clean and up to date. So come up with those routines that work for your organization, but ultimately don't archive all your files and don't hoard them. We have a tendency to hoard everything. Right, then we look at AI, right? So this is a slide that came out of the, it was Inspire, Microsoft Inspire. But basically AI uses the search of your tenant to find information. And so if your information is rubbish, then it just comes out as sparkly rubbish at the end of the day, right? So you got to make sure your data structure is clean, and when you use Copilot, then it actually returns responses that you would expect it to return as true and accurate. Because I guess as soon as someone gets a bad response that's not correct, then you start to distrust AI and you think, well, it's kind of useless, and you stop using it. So you got to make sure that every user in your organization gets a really good experience with using AI. Right, so let's look at common ways that we see that people handle their archives, right? So the most common way is people go, what archives? So unfortunately, yeah, the most common way is people don't even do anything, right? They have no archives, they don't have routines, and they just keep everything. Then we have some people that go, okay, well, I'm going to create an archive folder and I'm going to call it Z archive, which puts it to the bottom of the list, right? So that's a really common process, Z archive folders. The other one is someone in the organization becomes responsible. So this is someone with some power to do archiving, which is taking files out of your active sites and put them into some other site, which is kind of not active sites. And then the other one is you can use third-party software to build some automation and some rules to say when a document meets this criteria, we're automatically going to take it and put it somewhere else, right? So those are the common things. But let's delve into those a little bit closer. So for those that do nothing, which is probably the most common, I guess the attitude towards this is like, well, it's never been a problem, so I've never had to look and I've never had to fix it, right? But it is going to become more of a problem once we start heading down this AI era, right? So as you start introducing these tools that consume information, you're going to have to start cleaning up that information to make sure that you get the right responses. I think we have this attitude of you comfortable just keeping everything. I guess it's like a fear of losing access, or it's just like, well, it doesn't cost me anything to keep the document in that folder. There's no true cost unless you're paying for additional storage. I guess we've always got something else to do that's more important than cleaning up your files. But this is where coming up with some policies and making people responsible for it then actually works a little bit better for you. Okay, so typical problem is, yeah, nobody's responsible for it within your organization. And then the other one is tools fatigue, right? So it actually it's too bad to actually fix because you've got files across everything and now you're having to actually clean it up, right? So yeah, that's a huge problem. But once you've got it clean and under control, then you got to keep it clean and keep it under control, right? So that's what we look at helping people out most, is going from nothing to something. When we see people that have these Z archive folders, I just want to make it really clear that this is not actually archiving, because those files are still live. They're still active and accessible by all of your team. And sure, you can start messing with the permissions of that folder and making sure that some people don't have access to it or read only. But technically, it's still live data within your SharePoint environment, right? I will accept that it does make it easier later on when someone says we've run out of storage, we've got to do a cleanup. Like those are the easy pickings to say, well, let's just go through all those Z archive folders and clear it out, right? So there is some advantages to doing that. And it also makes your active files look clean. So when I was saying earlier, when you try and find the files and you can't find them, at least doing this gives you some kind of structure of saying, is those files or is these files? So I kind of like it, but it's not actually archiving, right? So it's all still live and accessible. The other option is there's someone with power, right? So someone who is a dedicated archive administrator. But when people work down this pathway, so you say, well, I'm going to make someone, an administrator, responsible for all of our data. What they then do is go, okay, well, maybe we'll have the Z archive folder and we'll just routinely go in and take all that stuff and put it somewhere else. Or they'll go through a routine of working out the age of a document and then removing all the documents, right? Now, the problem we see with this is that person then has to have permissions across all of your workspaces. So let's say they're an administrator, but you also need to archive your leadership documents, which might have some sensitive information, or your finance documents, or your HR documents, or your CEO documents, and things like that, right? So there's this hierarchy of permissions within that file structure. And that person, if they're going to be your archives administrator, would need to have access to all of that in both the current location and the archive location, right? So then we end up replicating that security, saying, well, only leaders can archive the leader stuff. The CEO can archive the CEO stuff, and finance can archive the finance stuff. So then all you have is just all the people that have access to this site content can now actually have access to this site content. So that doesn't actually fix the AI problem because they still have access as a user profile. And then I think, well, you could actually go, okay, well, everyone gets 2 user profiles. One's the archive user, but that just gets too painful, I think. And then what we see, right, in this scenario is what usually happens is, okay, well, the CEO or the leadership team will handle all the archiving. But then you get users coming to you saying, well, there was definitely a file in a folder in this location at some point, right? So you have to go to the leadership team, which, let's be honest, they got better things to do with their time than to try and restore files. And then 9 times out of 10, they dig through all the file structure, the file's not there, and then the staff member's like, oh, I found it. It's in my OneDrive. So it's things like that, right? It just wastes people's time. So we kind of want to come up with some automated routines around that, which is the next point. So building some rules to take out the documents and moving them to some cheaper storage. So there's lots of options for cheaper storage, whether it's like typically we look at what's called Azure blob storage. So taking it out of SharePoint, putting it into Azure blob storage, much cheaper, especially if you turn it on to cold storage, which you get pinged a slightly more expensive rate if you actually want to actively work within the documents in it, but you wouldn't do that anyway. You move it into the cold storage. If you want to reactivate it, you move it back out. But you still have some permissions issues, right? So who can actually access it within that storage? Then once you start splitting it into this dual storage system, it tends to be an IT problem then. So you have to go to your IT team to say to them, well, I need to restore that file, which may or may not exist based on the person's memory of where it lived. So it becomes still painful to manage those user requests. And then the other thing is some of the tools that we've seen have limited rules, right? So some of them are only based on age of the file. So there's some like date trigger to the file. So you end up with some limitations, and that doesn't help when it comes to things, what I was saying earlier about some files are aged, right? If they haven't been modified or accessed within 3 years, then we can archive them off. Some of them are based on the activity of the client or the project. So when a client is no longer active, the whole client gets archived. And then some of them are like daily, right? So this is correct. Yesterday's data is incorrect, right? So you end up having to build all of these complex rules. But I'm a big believer, big fan of automation. So this is my preferred method. But I'll show you some other things that we do as well. Right, let's just talk about common challenges in archiving. So most of the things are around people just don't have the routines and the responsibility to do it, and there's nobody following them up. There's also unclear metadata or naming conventions of files that makes it easy to identify what can or can't be archived. So, for those that know, SharePoint has document libraries and you can have metadata. You can build that metadata to then determine whether a file has this lifecycle, right? So you can have active, inactive file types. You can have, client tags, and when the client gets archived, then all of the files that are tagged with the client can then be archived, right? So you can look at that metadata as a method of identifying what can and can't be archived. Then there's the permissions issues. So, figuring out who has permissions to access both sides of the scale, whether you've got access to the live data or the archive data. So that just becomes sometimes too much effort. The other one is the manual effort and the time constraints. So it just takes a lot of time, right? And we talked about the permissions. That it usually ends up being the people with the most exposure to the most data within your company are the leadership teams or the highest paid resources, and you don't want them doing all of these restores and things like that. It's just kind of a waste of time. Right, so the way we do it, and so we use some tools for this, and I actually think these are really cool tools. And the reason being is you'll see here that we've got the existing folder structure. So you imagine this is a project, and within the project, we have drawings, programs, and any other folder structure. The documents within those folders, this one here is called Incident Investigation Report. So this was a PDF that was within those files. Now we've triggered, based off a rule, that this project is now finished and we're going to archive all of the content. So what it actually does is takes that PDF and puts it into the cold storage, right? So it's removed it from SharePoint, it's now no longer accessible, and has reduced your storage, but it replaces it with a URL. So you see it as a .url, so that's a hyperlink. So when a user who already has access to the file structure, so that folder structure, if they had access to it, they now still have access to it. So they can click that URL, and when they do, they can restore it, and it gives them this option to restore it back to its original location, or you can restore it to another new location, right? So you might just want to open something up and put it in your OneDrive. But for general use case, right, you just restore it back into client files. And this is a file by file method. And so you don't have to restore the entire team or the entire site. Because I know a lot of people that they go like, well, I'll archive the entire SharePoint site, right? So it's gone. If you want to get that one file out, you have to restore the entire site back again in order to open it up to then get this one file. So from here, you can actually just restore a single file. That does raise the question, what if you actually wanted to restore every single file? And yes, we could do that as well. But the point is, it's user initiated, right? So if you had access to it, you still have access to it. So you could just click restore and it brings it back down. And so why is this really awesome, right? So we can build automated rules. So this is using a third-party tool, which we can build rules based on the age of the file, but we can also build it on location specific as well. So we said for this site, it has a different rule. But because we love Power Automate, we can actually build some really sophisticated rules. So we can combine Power Automate to become like a process or human-driven function, not just based on the automatic rules that are available in the system. So we could do it on metadata change. So that's those columns. So if you change the column to be archive, we can trigger off the archives. Likewise, we can do it off other associated data triggers. So let's say you have a CRM and you mark the client as archived in the CRM, then we can run a trigger and say, well, now let's archive off the client files in SharePoint. We can do it through project management tools. When the project's complete, you archive it off. So if you think about all of those triggers that we can add, we could do it off, you close your accounts in Xero. Let's close the year off within your active files and things like that. There's heaps of opportunities for automating that. The other common one is you rename the folder, right? So we could do it off a trigger. So you rename the folder, you tag it with archived, that then kicks off the archiving, right? So, and then the other thing we talked about earlier, but whether you archive the site, the team, or the channel, then that can kick off the archives at a file level, not the entire thing. You just archive off the files so they could be individually restored. And what I really love about it is that user restored. So there's no admin required. The users could do it themselves. The folder structure and the file structure is retained for search. So you can actually still navigate your way through and validate that there was the file in there and you hadn't forgotten that you'd actually moved it somewhere else. And so you're not wasting people's time trying to restore files that don't exist. And then, yeah, the permissions are retained. So if you had access to the file, you still have access to the restore link, so you could bring it back down yourself. And it uses the cheaper external storage options. So you can actually then put it into Azure BLOB, and that tool manages the moves in and out of the Azure BLOB storage, right? So a lot cheaper than using the paid additional SharePoint storage, right? So that's a tool that we use. But really, my point is, you just have to come up with some way of cleansing your own data, cleaning it up. And I don't mind if you use that Z folder routine. At least that's some step towards cleaning it up and putting it into an isolated space. I think that's a good place to start, and then we can start looking at more sophisticated ways of managing it. But yeah, that's really it. So it was a bit of a quick one this month. Not too much to talk about, but just going to have a look at the Q&As. Oh, we got some things in the chat. Okay. Okay, Nathan, just saying you love the actual final version of a document, but we see that all the time. Yeah, very funny. Okay, what if you have a folder with files from 2010 to 2025? The archive process archives everything over 10 years old. So all the files between 2010 and 2015 will get archived. And then you need to provide a copy of the files to someone externally. So you've got to bring the archive files back from the cold storage into the folder so that you can download and share them. Yeah, so yeah, that is a common problem. So generally, rather than doing that 5-year range, we do try and make it a little bit more granular so that, we're obviously in 2025. So if you had a 10-year cycle, then you want to be archiving only the 2015 files because the previous ones would have already been archived. But yeah, retrospectively, sometimes cleaning that up is a little bit harder, but maybe going forward, each year you're tagging them with single years and then archiving them through those single year routines. And then the providing copy to someone externally. So just through that tool set, yeah, we would restore it maybe to a new location, right? So rather than livening up the site, we might restore it into an external shares site or into our own OneDrive, and then you could just provide it to someone through that. It does depend case by case. Sometimes you would just restore it back to the site. So if you lost a client, so you archived all their stuff and then they came back, you just reactivate that client again and bring all their files back. So it's case by case on that one. But thanks, Nick, for the question. Right, anything else? No? Okay, right. I just want to highlight the next event that we've got, which is coming up on Wednesday, the 29th of October. And we are talking about flexible sections in SharePoint. Now, this is really cool. So Gabrielle's going to be running this session. In SharePoint pages, there's this new feature where you can, it's like an open canvas, whereas previously web parts on a page in SharePoint were a little bit restricted, right? So it could only be a text block or it could only be an image. But now with these flexible sections, it's like an open canvas and you can drag and move things around, right? So for those that are into the style of your SharePoint, then that's going to be a great event for you to come along to. So make sure you check that one out. You can register there with the QR code. Otherwise, anyone who's subscribed on our newsletter is going to get reminded about it later. Speaking of newsletter subscriptions, don't forget, even if you've registered but you have unsubscribed, you're not going to get the recording. So if you don't get the recording, it's either going to be on YouTube, we'll share it on LinkedIn, or just let us know and we just need to resubscribe you again so you get those notifications. I think that's it. So thank you very much for joining. Hopefully I've covered some exciting things about archiving. It's not always the most exciting topic, but it is actually quite important. So yeah, if anyone has any questions on that, then feel free to reach out. Always happy to jump on a call and talk about how we can help with that one. But otherwise, you better go get cleaning up on your documents because I'm sure there's some old stuff that needs to get thrown out. So I'll leave you to it to do that. All right, thank you very much. Bye.